I just finished heating and weighing the hydrochloric extracts of the second True Color experiment. In this experiment, I cut this cactus with 3 sections. I split them into 5 centimeter sections. I mixed them so that it's uniform, and I weighed each section separately. There was a control. There was one treatment with 20 milligrams or 20 milliliters per liter of the True Color solution, and there was a second treatment experiment where I did repeat treatments for 2 weeks. Every 2 days I would reapply the 20 milliliters per liter solution of True Color. The first time I ran this experiment, I did it for only 2 weeks, and this second run on this experiment, I let it cure or age, whatever you want to call it, for the duration of a month. So the idea was to verify that the results that I got the first run were repeatable, and to see if a longer duration and possibly multiple applications would increase the yield of the alkaloids in increasing their biosynthesis. So the results were kind of unexpected, but they do make sense. So the control, in the end, it yielded 393 milligrams, which from the starting fresh weight is a yield of 0.0995% fresh, and from the dry weight it's 1.71% from the dry material. So the importance of mentioning the difference between the dry weight and the fresh weight is that the dry weight of the treated cacti were much lower. For some reason, there's a lower dry weight from treating with True Color. So the same exact starting weight, the first treatment which is a single application, the dry to wet weight, the control was 23% water, while the single treatment had 29% water. So when you dried it, there was a larger difference from the starting weight to the dry weight. The single treatment, which I'm just repeating but a longer duration, had 451 milligrams, which comes out to a fresh yield of 0.114% and a dry yield of 2.5%. And that's the starting weight for both were a difference of 1 gram. So those values are more comparable than the following. So the final section for the treatment of the experiment was multiple treatments every 2 days for 2 weeks, and then 2 weeks just allowing it to dry on its own. This is where there's a large discrepancy, and using the dry weight is not a true measure, I guess, for this experiment. But the fresh weight, there was still a small increase. So for the final treatment, there was a 389 gram yield. That's a difference of 4 milligrams from the control. But it did have a lower starting weight. It started at 381 grams fresh. So there was 28% water when I dried it. And the fresh yield for the second treatment was 0.102% fresh yield. But for the dry yield, it's 2.43%. So, like I mentioned at the start, there is an importance for me to state that the dry and the fresh weight yields were different. For the single treatment, it's comparable since they started basically uniform. But for the second treatment, the true difference is only 2.6% increase. So multiple treatments doesn't increase the yield. If anything, it keeps it equal or possibly even decreases it. The dry yield, there was a 42% increase of the dry yield over the control. But again, that's not a true measure since the dry weight of the control had less water loss than the treatments. So for that second presentation, I wouldn't say that's a fair increase yield description of the treatment. But the single treatment did prove to be stable and repeatable. If you look at purely the starting weights, the single treatment had 451 milligrams, so that's a fresh yield of 0.114%. And from the fresh yield, that's almost 15% increase over the control. And then if you compare it to the dry yield, the dry yield is 2.5%. And using that comparison, it's 46.2% increase over the control on the dry yield. So these results are a bit, I guess you could say a bit swayed, since when drying, for some reason, the treated cacti have a much lower dry weight than the control, which skews quite a bit the final yields of the treatments. Regardless, there was an increase of approximately 15% on the single treatment versus the control, even without regarding the dry weights, since that does skew the results quite a bit. Even forgetting that, there is a 15% increase in the biosynthesis of the alkaloids. In this case, I did total alkaloids rather than a specific technique, since when I previously did a cash extraction and I would wash the salts, I noticed that the washed salts that are soluble, which should be impurities in theory, they actually did contain some of the alkaloid that is the main active ingredient. But the insoluble, which is what traditionally you would consider the yield, the percentages and the amounts are quite swayed as well. So to not oversell this idea in this product, I decided to just do the raw total yield, and there is a guaranteed basically increase using the true color treatment. In this case, I did 1 month curing, I guess, and the previous attempt I did 2 weeks. Between the 2 week difference, which was a 40% increase about, and a 1 month increase of 46%, that's a difference between about 15% between the two. So you would decide if another 2 weeks is worth another 15% over the first yield increase. And if you're interested in getting yourself the recipe for the True Color solution, all I ask is that you not share the recipe publicly, since I would like to sell this for a little while. All you need to do is send a donation of $20 to either my Ko-Fi page or my PayPal, and send me an email saying that you would like the recipe, or a private message, or what have you. In the future, I will possibly continue experimenting with this, since that was my original plan, but I will not be using hydrochloric acid anymore. I'll just be replacing that with either an oxalate or some other acid I try to develop a easier extraction from. And yeah, I'll be presenting the raw information, and you can draw your own conclusions. I think the raw data is a better way to present this information rather than just the percentages of the dry yield, since, like I mentioned, the dry yield does change the yield quite drastically. So, like with other experiments, this needs to be repeated a few times, and different confirmations as well. I didn't notice the huge discrepancy with the dry yield versus the fresh yield my first run, and this shows a much smaller increase in biosynthesis, but a nearly 15%, 14.5% increase is still notable. The main thing that I've noticed is with the first attempt, this same issue with the dry yield, or the dry weight versus the dry weight of the control, it did also have this difference in the dry weight from the starting weight. If you compare the dry weight to the starting fresh weight, the difference isn't as marked. It's only about 1% difference from 5% yield, or 5% dry, to 4% dry. But I think in terms of actual percentage, that's maybe 10%, I think. I don't know. But yeah, that's one discrepancy that I've seen so far. But then again, that also brings into question every single yield that we do, since a majority of people use the dry yield percentage when comparing to other people or other cacti. There's always going to be a variable. If even using fresh weight, if I compare the fresh weight as soon as I cut the cuttings, or the cactus, it's already different from the fresh weight after 1 month. So yeah, I don't know what to make of the results if I compare it to the original fresh weight or not. In any case, this is interesting for people that want to store less material, and have a stronger yield, I guess, or if you want to consume a lower amount of material, there's also that 50% increase in content through the dry weight. So there is that difference. But yeah, I don't know what to make of the results exactly. But in any case, I shared the results. I got similar results to the first run with a single treatment, and the dry yields do make a big difference in the actual increase in content. So let me know what you guys think, if the dry yield is the true yield, or if I should just compare it to the fresh yield from the very first cut. So this does also bring into question if curing our cuttings actually has a benefit over not curing them. I didn't have a control where I cut it and extract as soon as I cut it, but other people can do that. And I'll see that also I'll be calculating the difference in yields from the original fresh cut, which already had a 15% increase, and then also comparing the fresh weights after the 1 month period to see how much of a difference that does as well.